The masses treat every room as a contest of intensity. Who speaks loudest, who reacts fastest, who wins the exchange in the first 5 minutes. History's more durable operators understood something colder. Most rooms are not won in the first 5 minutes at all. They are won in the 5th hour, the 5th meeting, the 5th year, by whoever simply never left. This is not passivity dressed up as strategy. Outlasting a room requires more discipline than winning one quickly, because it demands a strategist sit through boredom, hostility, and repeated dismissal without spending the one resource, her composure, that the room is quietly testing the entire time. Everyone in that room, whether they'd admit it or not, is waiting to see who breaks first. The strategist has already decided, long before she sat down, that it will not be her. 10 laws follow, extracted from people who understood, across very different centuries and very different rooms, that patience is not the absence of power. It is frequently power's most complete expression. There is a specific kind of test embedded in almost every room worth winning. A moment, usually unannounced, when the pressure or the boredom or the sheer duration of the exchange invites everyone present to quietly reveal how much they actually wanted the outcome. Most people fail this test without ever realizing it was being administered. They simply grow tired, or bored, or eager to be somewhere else, and that fatigue reads to everyone remaining as a kind of concession, regardless of what was actually said. The strategist treats every room as though this test were running constantly, because it usually is. Everything in this record depends on a single reversal of instinct. The room is not won by whoever reacts fastest to what's happening in it. It is won by whoever is still occupying it once the reacting has stopped mattering. Begin with the law every other law in this record depends on. The first law. Let stillness be the first thing that outlasts them. Catherine of Aragon, married for over 2 decades to Henry VIII of England, spent the final years of that marriage defending its legitimacy against a king determined to annul it by any means available, legal, religious, and eventually personal. She was pressured, isolated, and separated from her daughter, and still she refused for years to concede the argument or leave the position she considered rightfully hers, continuing to sign her correspondence as queen until her death, regardless of what the court around her had already decided to call her instead. The annulment eventually proceeded without her consent. It never proceeded with it, and the refusal itself, sustained for years past the point most observers expected her to yield, became its own form of historical record, outlasting the marriage that produced it. Empress Suiko, ruling as Japan's first reigning empress, navigated decades of rivalry among powerful clans vying for influence at court, and did so largely through patient, sustained presence rather than dramatic confrontation, remaining on the throne for over 3 decades during a period when court rivals were regularly removed through far more violent means. Her reign's stability was not an accident of favorable circumstance. It was the accumulated result of simply outlasting, year after year, rivals who assumed a woman's rule would prove temporary. This is the first law. Stillness, sustained long enough, becomes its own form of argument. The masses treat every room as something to be won quickly, through the sharpest point or the fastest comeback, and abandon the position the moment the exchange stops feeling winnable in the short term. The strategist treats a room the way both of these women treated their positions, as ground to be occupied for as long as occupying it serves her, regardless of how long the opposition expects the occupation to last. There is a structural reason duration accumulates authority, independent of any single decision made during it. Every new arrival to a room where someone has already been present for years inherits an asymmetry of information they cannot immediately close. They do not know the full history, the prior precedents, the reasons a given practice exists, and this asymmetry alone confers a form of quiet authority on whoever has simply been there longest, regardless of formal rank. Translate this into an ordinary negotiation. The other party raises their voice, expecting a reaction that ends the conversation on their terms. The strategist says less, not more, and simply remains in the chair, in the position, in the room, until the other party's urgency, unmatched by an equal urgency in return, begins to work against them instead of for them. there is a principle from negotiation research worth naming directly. The party who appears to need a resolution fastest typically extracts the worst terms because urgency is legible to the other side and gets priced into every offer that follows. A negotiator who visibly has nowhere else to be signals, without saying a word, that time itself is on the other side's terms. The strategist who can simply remain unhurried, unbothered by silence, in no observable rush to conclude the exchange, removes that leverage entirely and frequently finds the other party conceding ground simply to end a silence they, not she, found unbearable. Stillness holds a room. It does not, on its own, survive deliberate pressure applied specifically to break it. The second law concerns what happens when someone tries to force the exit stillness alone was meant to prevent. The second law: endure longer than your adversary budgeted for. Nellie Bly, working as a journalist in the late 19th century, had herself committed to a New York asylum under a false identity in order to investigate and expose the abusive conditions patients endured there, and remained inside for 10 days, enduring cold, poor food, and rough treatment from staff, who had no reason to suspect she could simply leave whenever she chose to stop gathering material. She outlasted the conditions specifically because she had budgeted in advance for exactly how long she intended to endure them, and the resulting exposé produced real reforms to how such institutions were run. Alice Paul, campaigning for women's suffrage in the United States, was arrested and imprisoned for picketing the White House, and while imprisoned, undertook a hunger strike that prison authorities responded to with force-feeding, carried out repeatedly over weeks. She did not yield the demand that had gotten her imprisoned in the first place. She simply endured the response to it for longer than the institution attempting to break her had budgeted for, and public reaction to the treatment she endured became part of what eventually built momentum toward the amendment she had been arrested for demanding. The masses assume that whoever applies the most pressure in a conflict wins it. The second law reveals a more precise truth. Pressure only works on an opponent who breaks before the pressure runs out, and every application of pressure has, whether its user realizes it or not, a budget, a length of time its user expects to need before the other side yields. An adversary who has budgeted for a week of resistance and encounters a woman prepared to endure a month has already lost the exchange, regardless of how the room appeared to be going in that first week. In an ordinary version of this law, consider a difficult conversation someone else expects to win through sheer discomfort, expecting you to concede simply to make the discomfort stop. The strategist calculates, before the exchange even begins, roughly how long the other party is likely prepared to sustain that discomfort themselves, and ensures her own capacity to endure it outlasts theirs. This is a discipline of preparation more than temperament. Before entering any exchange expected to be difficult, the strategist asks plainly, how long is the other side actually equipped to sustain this pressure, given their own patience, their own stakes, their own competing demands on their time? Elizabeth Cady Stanton co-organized the first women's rights convention in the United States and spent decades afterward drafting resolutions, organizing campaigns, and enduring public ridicule that followed her for the rest of her working life, continuing the work through personal hardship and repeated setbacks that would have exhausted a less prepared campaigner within a fraction of the time. She had, in effect, budgeted for a fight measured in decades rather than years, and outlasted several generations of opposition that had budgeted for considerably less. The ordinary version of this shows up whenever a disagreement resurfaces with a new person making the same tired objection an earlier generation of critics already raised and lost. The strategist recognizes the pattern rather than treating each new objector as a fresh threat, requiring a fresh, exhausting defense. She has already outlasted this argument once and simply continues, letting the recycled objection wear itself out against a position that has already survived it before. An opponent with a flight to catch, a meeting after this one, or simply less invested in the outcome than she is, has already lost the exchange on a timeline, regardless of how sharp their opening argument was. Maria Mitchell spent years of patient nightly observation before discovering a comet in 1847, work that required the same telescope pointed at the same patch of sky for months at a time, long after the novelty of the search had worn off for anyone with less discipline than she brought to it. The discovery made her the first woman elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, but the achievement itself was simply the visible tip of thousands of quiet, uneventful hours that most observers would have abandoned as unproductive long before they produced anything at all. Consider what this looks like away from a telescope entirely. A slow professional negotiation where nothing appears to be happening for weeks, a difficult family situation that seems, day to day, entirely unchanged. The masses read this apparent stillness as failure and abandon the position out of frustration with how little seems to be moving. The strategist treats the absence of visible movement as simply the ordinary texture of patient work, indistinguishable from the inside, from work that is quietly succeeding. Enduring a single application of pressure is one skill. Outlasting rivals across years, long after any single confrontation has been forgotten, is a different scale of the same discipline entirely. The third law. Outlast rivals. Simply by remaining in the position, Queen Victoria reigned for over 6 decades, a length of tenure that meant she outlasted numerous prime ministers, foreign rivals, and members of her own extended family, who had, at various points, expected to outlive or outmaneuver her politically. Her influence over the course of her reign grew not from any single dramatic confrontation, but from the accumulated weight of sheer duration. Decades of experience that every new minister arriving in office had to reckon with, regardless of their own ambitions, simply because she had already been on the throne longer than most of them had been in public life at all. Queen Tamar of Georgia presided over what is still remembered as a golden age for her kingdom, consolidating a stable, prosperous reign across a region where neighboring rivals regularly rose and fell within a fraction of the time she remained in power. Her reign's stability was not the product of a single decisive battle. It was the product of patient, sustained governance that simply continued year after year, while rival claims to influence around her rose and dissolved. The masses assume that power is won through a single decisive confrontation, the argument that ends the debate, the negotiation that settles the matter permanently. The third law suggests something quieter and, in the long run, considerably more durable. A position held consistently, without interruption, across enough time accumulates an authority that no single confrontation could produce on its own. Tenure itself becomes a form of leverage, because everyone new who enters the room must eventually reckon with a duration of presence they were not there to witness the beginning of. Consider the modern equivalent. A colleague, however talented, who joined an organization 18 months ago carries less institutional authority in a disagreement with someone who has been there a decade, regardless of who is technically correct on the point being argued. Not because tenure equals competence, but because tenure has already survived every previous attempt to dislodge it, and survival itself becomes a credential no argument alone can quickly match. Empress Zoe of Byzantium survived multiple marriages, a forced convent exile, and repeated palace intrigue across decades at the center of imperial politics, eventually returning to co-rule the empire in her 60s after opponents had, at various points, assumed her political life finished entirely. Each attempt to remove her permanently from power failed to account for how many times she had already outlasted a similar attempt before it. In an ordinary career, this looks like surviving a round of organizational upheaval, a change in leadership, a restructuring that was supposed to make a particular position obsolete, and simply remaining in it anyway, long enough that the next round of upheaval arrives to find her still there, with more institutional memory than whoever is attempting the change this time. Tenure accumulates authority passively, simply through duration. Some conflicts require a more active version of the same patience, a deliberate refusal to force a resolution faster than the situation actually rewards. The fourth law. Win the siege by refusing to rush the walls. Isabella I of Castile, pursuing the final campaign of the Reconquista against the last Muslim stronghold at Granada, chose not to rush the city with a costly direct assault, but instead built an entire permanent settlement, the city of Santa Fe, specifically to sustain a patient, extended siege for as long as the campaign required, understanding that a siege won through patience, preserved resources, a rushed assault would have squandered. The city fell eventually, not to a dramatic breach, but to the simple accumulated pressure of a besieging force that had made clear, through the permanence of its own settlement, that it intended to remain exactly as long as necessary. Anne of Austria, serving as regent for her young son during a period of aristocratic rebellion known as the Fronde, weathered years of instability, exile from the capital, and open challenges to her authority, maintaining her regency through patient endurance rather than any single decisive military victory over the rebellion. The rebellion eventually exhausted itself, in no small part because the regency it was attempting to unseat simply outlasted its energy. This is the fourth law. Some conflicts are not won by the party that strikes hardest, but by the party willing to settle in for a longer campaign than its opponent expected to fight. The masses want the confrontation resolved quickly, and this eagerness for quick resolution is frequently exactly what an opponent is counting on to extract a concession that patience would never have granted. The strategist, facing a siege of any kind, a hostile negotiation, a prolonged family conflict, a professional standoff, asks first whether a rushed resolution actually serves her, or whether settling in, visibly, for the length of time the position actually requires would extract far better terms than urgency ever could. Consider a modern version of a siege, a hostile workplace dispute, a prolonged family disagreement, a landlord or institution counting on exhaustion to produce a concession. The strategist facing this kind of standoff resists the pressure to resolve it on a fast timeline, specifically because the other party is very often counting on that pressure to extract a worse outcome than patience would eventually produce. Settling in, visibly, for the length of time the position actually deserves is itself a signal that changes what the other side is willing to offer. Matilda of Tuscany spent years defending her territories against the Holy Roman Emperor's forces, enduring prolonged sieges and shifting alliances across a conflict that stretched across decades rather than resolving in any single campaign season, and her territories remained substantially intact at the end of a struggle her opponents had originally expected to conclude far more quickly. The modern version rarely involves literal territory, but the underlying calculation is identical: a protracted professional or legal dispute, where the other side is counting on your resources or resolve running out before theirs do. The strategist who has genuinely settled in for the length the dispute requires, rather than hoping for a quick resolution, routinely outlasts an opponent who never planned for a fight this long. A siege can be won within a single patient campaign. Some efforts, though, are never vindicated within the lifetime of the person who began them at all, and the discipline required for that kind of patience is considerably harder to sustain. The fifth law: let vindication arrive on its own schedule. Susan B. Anthony campaigned for decades for women's suffrage in the United States, was arrested and tried for the act of voting before it was legally permitted for women to do so, and died 14 years before the constitutional amendment she had spent most of her adult life advocating for was finally ratified. She did not live to see the vindication her decades of work produced. She continued the work regardless, understanding, correctly as it turned out, that a cause's timeline does not always align with a single advocate's lifetime, and that the work still matters even when its full vindication belongs to people who will outlive its original champion. Wilma Mankiller became the first woman to serve as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, facing considerable resistance to the idea of a woman holding that position at all, including threats during her early campaign for office. She governed regardless, and over the course of her tenure, the resistance that had greeted her election gave way to broad recognition of the tribal development programs and infrastructure improvements her leadership produced, vindication that arrived gradually across years of continued governance rather than in the moment of her initial election. The masses want vindication to arrive quickly, on a timeline that matches the length of the argument that produced the disagreement in the first place. The strategist understands that some forms of vindication are simply not available on that timeline, that the outcome of years of patient, dismissed, or ridiculed effort sometimes arrives only after the effort itself has continued far longer than the initial critics ever expected it to. Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross after years of independent humanitarian work that was, in its early stages, met with considerable skepticism about whether a civilian relief organization run by a woman could sustain itself at all. The organization she built continued operating and expanding for decades after critics had expected it to fold, and the vindication of the original idea arrived gradually, disaster relief effort by disaster relief effort, rather than in any single moment of official recognition. This is worth sitting with specifically because it resists the instinct to measure progress by a single milestone. A body of work, a reputation, a cause, all of it is frequently vindicated the way Barton's organization was. Gradually, unglamorously, disaster by disaster, decision by decision, with no single day on which the skeptics were formally proven wrong. The strategist stops waiting for that single day and simply keeps producing the results that, cumulatively, make the skepticism increasingly irrelevant. This requires a particular kind of discipline that has little to do with optimism, continuing to do the work well, at full quality, on a timeline that may not reward the person doing it within her own working life. The masses tie their motivation to visible, near-term proof that the effort is working. The strategist decouples the two, understanding that some of the most consequential work in the historical record was produced by women who never received confirmation, in their own lifetimes, that it had mattered at all. Some rooms are political, institutional, or social. Others are simply physical, a body that must be patiently persuaded to recover, or trained on a timeline no amount of will alone can shorten. The sixth law: let patience outlast the body's own resistance. Wilma Rudolph contracted polio as a young child and was told she would likely never walk without assistance, spending years in patient, sustained physical therapy and rehabilitation before eventually becoming an Olympic champion sprinter, winning 3 gold medals at a single Games. The years of rehabilitation that preceded that achievement required a form of patience with her own body that had nothing to do with a single dramatic recovery and everything to do with sustained, unglamorous effort, repeated for longer than most observers would have expected to produce results at all. Gertrude Ederle became the first woman to swim the English Channel, a crossing that required over 14 hours of continuous swimming through cold water and difficult currents, on an attempt that came after an earlier failed effort the year before. The successful crossing was not a single moment of triumph, so much as the accumulated result of patience, sustained across more than half a day of continuous physical effort, longer than most of the men who had previously made the same crossing had required. The masses assume that physical adversity is overcome through a single decisive effort, the comeback, the triumphant return. The sixth law suggests something more accurate: physical endurance, whether recovering from illness or completing a grueling feat, is won through patience sustained well past the point where quitting would have been entirely reasonable. And the record remembers the woman who simply continued past that point, rather than the moment any single obstacle was overcome. Annie Smith Peck did not begin serious mountaineering until middle age, and continued making significant first ascents well into her 60s and 70s, at a stage of life when most of her contemporaries, male or female, had long since assumed climbing was behind them. The patience required was not simply physical. It was the sustained refusal to accept that a body past a certain age had nothing left to attempt. The ordinary application of this extends past age into any assumed expiration date placed on ambition. The idea that a particular pursuit belongs only to an earlier stage of life, an earlier point in a career, a window that is supposedly already closed. The strategist treats these assumed windows the way Peck treated the mountain still in front of her, as claims worth testing directly, rather than accepting simply because they are commonly repeated. There is a principle from the study of skill acquisition and rehabilitation worth naming directly. Measurable progress in physical recovery or endurance training is rarely linear, and long stretches of apparent stagnation are a normal, expected part of the process, rather than evidence that the effort has failed. The masses interpret a plateau as a signal to quit. The strategist treats it as simply another mile of an already long ascent, unremarkable in itself, and keeps going regardless of whether that day's effort produced any visible result at all. Physical patience is largely a private discipline. The seventh law returns to a room full of other people, specifically a hostile one, and asks what composure, sustained long enough, can accomplish against open opposition. The seventh law: outlast a hostile room through unbothered hospitality. Dolley Madison, as the wife of the fourth American president, managed the social and political landscape of a young capital through hospitality that historians credit with softening some of the fiercest partisan divisions of the era, remaining, by all accounts, remarkably composed even during the War of 1812, when she personally ensured the evacuation of important state documents and a portrait of Washington before British forces burned the presidential residence, and continued hosting and navigating Washington society for decades afterward, as though the interruption had simply been an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Abigail Adams navigated decades of political hostility and personal isolation during her husband's long public career, managing a household and considerable correspondence through periods of war, political upheaval, and prolonged separation, maintaining an unbothered, steady presence in Washington's political and social landscape across an era when the position she occupied offered no formal power at all. Only the influence-patient, sustained presence could accumulate. The masses treat a hostile room as something to be either avoided or confronted directly. The seventh law offers a third option: remaining in the room, warm and composed, for so long and so consistently that hostility eventually exhausts itself against a presence that never gave it the reaction it was looking for. A hostile room, tested against genuine, sustained calm rather than an equally hostile response, tends to run out of energy well before the calm does. Martha Washington maintained composure and hospitality through the hardship of successive winter encampments during the Revolutionary War, including the brutal conditions at Valley Forge, where her presence among the troops is credited with sustaining morale through a period that might otherwise have fractured it entirely. The hospitality was not incidental warmth. It was a deliberate, sustained presence, maintained through conditions considerably more hostile than any single difficult dinner party. Most hostile rooms a modern woman encounters are considerably milder than a winter military encampment, which is precisely the point. If composure can be sustained through genuine hardship, it can certainly be sustained through a difficult meeting, an uncomfortable family gathering, or a colleague determined to provoke a reaction. The bar Martha Washington cleared was considerably higher than most rooms will ever actually demand. There is a simple mechanism underneath this: hostility, sustained without any escalation to feed on, tends to consume the energy of whoever is producing it far faster than it drains the person absorbing it calmly. An angry room expects to be met with either capitulation or an equally hostile response, and receives neither. Deprived of the reaction it was generating hostility in order to produce, the hostility itself has nowhere left to go, and typically exhausts itself well before the composed party's patience runs out. A hostile room made of individuals can be outlasted through composure. A hostile institution, made of policies and precedent rather than any single person, requires a different, more grinding form of the same patience. The eighth law: outlast institutional resistance through sheer persistence. Elizabeth Blackwell applied to dozens of medical schools before finally being accepted, reportedly admitted, partly because the school students, polled on the unusual application, voted to accept her as something of a joke. And she went on to become the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, then spent decades afterward building institutions to train and support other women seeking the same path, enduring professional isolation and open hostility from a medical establishment that had never intended to make room for her at all. Belva Lockwood spent years petitioning to be permitted to argue cases before the United States Supreme Court, a right no woman had held before her, facing repeated institutional refusal before finally securing legislation that allowed her to become the first woman admitted to practice there. The persistence required was measured in years of sustained petitioning rather than a single successful argument. And the resistance she outlasted was bureaucratic and institutional rather than any single identifiable opponent she could simply out-argue. The masses encounter institutional resistance and treat it as a wall requiring a single, forceful breakthrough. The strategist recognizes that institutions rarely yield to force. They yield to persistence, sustained longer than the institution's capacity to keep refusing, a form of resistance that is rarely defeated so much as it is simply outlasted, refusal by refusal, until the refusing stops. Sarah Josepha Hale campaigned for decades, writing letters to 5 successive presidents before finally securing a national Thanksgiving holiday, a request that had been declined or ignored for years before Abraham Lincoln finally granted it in the midst of the Civil War. The institutional resistance she faced was not a single refusal, but dozens of them, spread across more than a decade, and she simply continued submitting the request until a moment arrived when refusing it cost more than granting it. The lesson generalizes cleanly. An institution's refusal is rarely a permanent verdict, however final it sounds in the moment it's delivered. It is simply the current cost-benefit calculation of the person or body issuing it, and that calculation shifts over time, with circumstances, with sustained pressure. The strategist treats a no as a snapshot of a particular moment, rather than a permanent ruling, and returns when the moment has had time to shift. Institutions, unlike individuals, do not grow tired in any single conversation, but the people staffing them do, and institutional resistance is, in practice, simply a long sequence of individual refusals, each one requiring a person to actively decide to refuse again. A petitioner who returns calmly and repeatedly, refusing to disappear after the first several refusals, is betting correctly that at some point, continuing to refuse costs the institution more energy than simply granting the request. Institutions are outlasted through repetition. Difficult terrain, literal or otherwise, is outlasted through something closer to pacing. The discipline of moving only as fast as a long journey actually allows. The 9th law, outlast. Harsh terrain through sustained patience, not speed. Isabella Bird traveled extensively through remote and difficult terrain across multiple continents during the Victorian era, doing so for decades, despite chronic ill health that might reasonably have confined a less patient traveler to a single climate, producing travel writing that documented regions few Western observers had recorded before her. Her career was not built on any single dramatic expedition, but on sustained, patient travel repeated across decades, in spite of a body that frequently worked against her. Freya Stark explored remote regions of the Middle East over a career that spanned decades, often traveling alone through terrain and cultures unfamiliar to her, building a body of work and expertise gradually across an unusually long working life, rather than through any single celebrated crossing. Her endurance was measured less in any single feat of physical difficulty, and more in the sheer sustained duration of a career, built one patient expedition at a time. The masses assume that difficult terrain, whether literal or metaphorical, is conquered through speed, urgency, and a single decisive push through the hardest section. The 9th law suggests the opposite. Terrain that is genuinely difficult rewards a slower, sustained pace maintained across a much longer period than urgency would allow, and the travelers remembered longest are rarely the fastest, but the ones who simply kept going the longest. Sacagawea traveled thousands of miles across difficult and unfamiliar terrain as part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, doing so while caring for an infant son carried for much of the journey, through terrain and conditions that tested the endurance of every member of the party, regardless of experience. Her sustained presence across the full length of an arduous, multi-year expedition was not a single feat of endurance, but a continuous one, renewed every day of a journey that offered no shortcut through its difficulty. This is the clearest possible illustration of a principle worth carrying into far less dramatic circumstances. Some undertakings simply cannot be rushed, regardless of how badly a faster pace is wanted, and attempting to force a shortcut through terrain that does not permit one usually costs more than the patience it was meant to save. This applies well past literal terrain. A demanding project, a difficult professional transition, a long personal rebuilding after a setback, all of it tends to reward a pace that can actually be sustained across its full length, rather than an intense pace that collapses partway through. The strategist asks, before setting any pace at all, not how fast she can move today, but what pace she could plausibly sustain for as long as the terrain in front of her is likely to last. 9 laws address specific rooms, specific sieges, specific bodies of resistance. The final law is the simplest, and, in some ways, the hardest. What happens when a woman simply refuses to leave any of them, long after everyone expected her to? The 10th law: simply remain when everyone else has left. Katharine Graham took over as publisher of a major American newspaper after her husband's sudden death, at a time when few expected a woman with no prior background running a news organization to hold the position for long, and went on to lead the paper through some of the most consequential and legally fraught decisions in its history, remaining at the helm through crises that many observers assumed would force her resignation. She simply continued, decision after decision, year after year, until the question of whether she belonged in the position had been answered entirely by the fact that she was still occupying it. Julia Child spent years developing and pitching a cookbook that publishers repeatedly rejected before it was finally accepted, and did not begin her television career until well into middle age, by which point most people in a comparable position might reasonably have concluded that the opportunity had already passed them by. She had simply outlasted her own rejections, continuing to develop the work regardless of how many publishers had already declined it, and remained active in her field for decades afterward, long after the earlier rejections had stopped mattering to anyone at all, including her. This is the final and simplest law in the entire record, and also the hardest to practice with any consistency. Many rooms, many careers, many long conflicts are not won by whoever is most talented, or most correct, or even most patient in any single exchange. They are won by whoever is still there, still in the chair, still in the field, still publishing, still governing, after everyone else who might have contested the position has grown tired, moved on, or given up entirely. Presence, sustained long enough, eventually stops requiring justification. It simply becomes the fact the room has to work around. Eleanor Roosevelt remained an active and influential public figure for decades after her time as First Lady formally ended, continuing to write, advocate, and serve in official capacities, including at the United Nations well into old age, at a stage of life when many public figures of her era had long since receded from view. She simply remained engaged, publicly and consistently, for so long that her continued presence became in itself a form of institutional memory. Younger officials had to reckon with, regardless of their own formal authority. This is the clearest demonstration in the entire record of what sustained presence eventually becomes. Not merely surviving in a position, but becoming, through sheer duration, a reference point every newer arrival must eventually consult, whether or not any formal title requires them to. Every law in this record, examined together, reduces to a single mechanism worth stating plainly. Most contests of will are decided less by who is right, and more by who remains. The masses measure a room by its opening minutes, who spoke best, who reacted fastest, who seemed, in that moment, most impressive. The strategist measures a room by its final hour, understanding that the final hour belongs, almost without exception, to whoever simply never got up to leave. Before the closing, 10 laws, 1 underlying discipline, presence, sustained past the point where it was expected to end. Closing. On the victory that only time can confer. None of the laws in this record describe a fast path to anything. Every woman named here won what she won across years, not minutes, through sieges, imprisonments, decades of institutional refusal, illness patiently outlasted, rooms held through sheer, sustained composure rather than a single decisive blow. The masses will always prefer the quick victory, the fast argument, the room won in its first 5 minutes. Let them. Quick victories are also quickly forgotten, and quickly reversed by whoever simply refuses to leave after the applause has ended. You now have 10 laws about a form of power that cannot be rushed, only sustained. Consider them once more, stripped to their working parts. Let stillness speak before urgency does. Endure past the point your opponent budgeted for. Let tenure itself accumulate authority no single argument could produce. Win the siege by refusing to rush it. Let vindication arrive on its own schedule, even past your own lifetime if it must. Let patience outlast whatever resistance your own body offers. Meet a hostile room with hospitality that never runs out first. Outlast institutions through persistence, measured in years, not conversations. Cross difficult terrain at a pace you can actually sustain to the end of it. And simply remain, in the chair, in the field, in the position, long after everyone who doubted you expected you to have already left. Outlast the room. The room, eventually, will do the rest.